A strange anomaly unfolded upon the Milanese ice on that particular afternoon. It was neither a catastrophic tumble nor a glaring error. Rather, a profound, eerie subtlety took hold. Initially, the spectators remained utterly oblivious. The stadium masses were merely getting comfortable fabric rustling against rigid seating, disjointed chatter echoing through the bleachers, lenses snapping into focus, and mobile screens illuminating the dimness. Typically, an instance like this simply dissolves into the ambient white noise of a competitive event. Yet on this specific occasion, a handful of sharp eyes caught the shift. Down at the evaluator's desk, a single adjudicator pitched forward nothing theatrical, merely tweaking his line of sight to lock dead center on the frozen stage. Seconds later, a second scorer subtly repositioned themselves in their seat. These were minuscule gestures, but in this intricate sport, the tiniest flinch from the panel signals an impending tremor. Anchoring the dead center stood Ilia Malinin. Velocity was entirely absent. Surprisingly, he navigated the frozen boundary with an uncharacteristic sluggishness, executing a velvety sweep hugging the outer boards. His steel runners etched delicate, shimmering trails across the frost. A silent thrust followed by a second. For anyone remotely familiar with his prior performances, that singular sluggishness would trip an immediate alarm after all. Blistering momentum is his undisputed trademark. Throughout the past couple of competitive years, this athlete cultivated a mystique so grand it bordered on absolute myth upon first listen. Supporters crowned him the Quad God, which was no tongue-in-cheek moniker, but a literal decree of his prowess. Back in 2022, he shattered history by becoming the pioneer to ever stick a flawless 4-revolution axle on a global stage. We are talking about defying gravity with 4.5 airborne spins, an impossibly daring feat theorists argued over for years, yet virtually no one dared to execute. Decades passed with that maneuver locked in the realm of sheer fantasy. Then this prodigy struck, instantly shattering the perceived boundaries of the discipline forever. Therefore, whenever a daredevil celebrated for his dynamite velocity kicks off a sequence at a crawl, the atmosphere shifts. Hovering by the press barriers, a duo of journalists had been sharing hushed theories since early daytime. No loud declarations, merely muted guesswork. Word on the street suggested a severe alteration in his program layout. We are not talking minor tweaks, but a fundamental architectural overhaul. A continental instructor who caught his dawn warm-ups allegedly let slip a cryptic remark while roaming the corridors. The mentor never claimed the performance had improved or degraded. He exclusively labeled it as foreign. At the absolute pinnacle of this sport, the word foreign packs an earth-shattering punch. Usually, these routines are meticulously calculated with mind-bending accuracy. Trainers meticulously chart the blueprint, mathematically plotting leap placements to harvest maximum scores while preserving vital endurance. Opening salvos, central combination barrages, and trailing point boosters form a predictable skeletal frame. However, whispers swirling through the complex hinted he had violently dismantled the core anatomy. Beyond superficial dance steps, the very foundation was mutated. Suddenly, the soundtrack flared to life. A deep, rumbling frequency bled through the audio system. It deliberately lacked the booming, theatrical symphony so many competitors use as a crutch. Instead, it was an agonizingly sluggish, heavily moody, and profoundly cinematic reverberation. He propelled himself onward. Still, he refused to take flight. 20 ticks slipped away, then 30. From the nosebleed sections, an onlooker audibly murmured, "Why is he just stalling out there?" And honestly, that inquiry was entirely justified. An athlete synonymous with lethal difficulty typically floors the gas pedal straight into their opening launch. Defying logic, the prodigy carved yet another sweeping arc across the slick expanse, an extended cruise. Burying his blade deep and abruptly, the colossal venue swallowed its own noise. No authority demanded silence. Rather, a collective, terrifying realization washed over the masses that an unprecedented anomaly was hatching. Seated at the command center, an authority figure darted his eyes toward his technical roster before snapping them aggressively back onto the frozen arena. The reason? The flight path being sketched into the frost violently contradicted the pre-approved schematic of the performance. Right then, an invisible current altered the stadium's atmosphere. It was absolutely not raw thrill just yet, it was sheer, unadulterated intrigue. The skater pitched a fraction of his weight onto his portside blade. As his torso twisted, his frame locked into a launch posture that seasoned veterans spotted instantly. Airborne action was imminent, but the runway approach was utterly cursed. It was frighteningly truncated and dangerously straightforward. For one breathless fraction of a heartbeat, multiple experts manning the analytical desk shared a unified, terrifying hypothesis. If that aggressive runway vector signified their worst suspicions, this master was entirely scrapping the anticipated opening leap. He was winding up to unleash an entirely different beast, a phantom maneuver. No living soul inside that coliseum had witnessed him execute. Abruptly, the hushed stadium morphed into something suffocating. It felt as though the concrete walls themselves were choking back oxygen. Time itself appeared to drag its heels throughout the stands. It was not absolute dead air, but perilously close. The audio systems continued to bleed out a faint, thumping heartbeat, saturating the freezing atmosphere. Nevertheless, virtually not a single soul was registering the melody. The collective focus had utterly derailed. Every eyeball was magnetized to the ominous path being slashed into the frost by the prodigy. Terminating his abbreviated loop, he surged onward. Relentlessly poised, terrifyingly precise. Frankly, his composure was bordering on supernatural. That specific nuance carried profound gravity, far beyond layman comprehension. Competitors gearing up for suicide-level leaps always manifest obvious, frantic horsepower. Lengthy runways, aggressive overlapping strides, and blistering velocity accelerating over the frost. Our champion was completely ignoring the playbook. Forget the long, sweeping wind-ups. His approach carved a tight, aggressively short path across the rink, all business, no hesitation. Down at rinkside, a seasoned technical official let their pen drift away from the clipboard. In today's sport, an approach that abrupt telegraphs only a handful of moves, and one of them borders on insanity. Malinin sank deep into his edges, pulling his arms tight against his chest. That coiled, spring-loaded crouch vanished in a heartbeat. Yet anyone who knew the ice caught the unmistakable physics at play. Zero wasted motion, pure calculation. And then, he launched into the frozen air. The explosion off the ice struck with such blinding speed that half the arena might miss the liftoff, only catching him as a spinning blur against the rafters. He snapped into a rigid axis instantly, shoulders welded in place, legs crossed flawlessly, whipping into the spin the millisecond his blade left the surface. The centrifugal force dialed up to an unreadable velocity, completely defying human vision. 1 revolution, 2, 3, 4. Veteran broadcasters practically choke trying to tally the spins live. The human mind simply cannot decode that kind of speed without leaning on slow-motion playback. Yet the officials sitting behind the glass weren't playing a guessing game. Their eyes locked onto the cold, hard mechanics, the precise angle of the lifting blade, the sheer altitude of the flight, the ironclad discipline of his posture midair, every microscopic variable that spells the difference between legendary points and a devastating downgrade. When the prodigy finally plummeted back down, his steel hit the ice with a violent, satisfying crunch that ricocheted off the stadium walls. A fierce plume of crystallized ice kicked up into the lights. He absorbed the earth-shattering impact, fighting a slightly off-axis gravity. The landing foot drifted a fraction of an inch beyond perfection before locking down hard, but he had survived it, and it was undeniably solid. The building didn't explode immediately. Instead, a haunting, breath-holding silence blanketed the thousands of spectators. Every single person under that roof was trapped in a shared paralysis, mentally screaming the exact same thing. Did our eyes just deceive us? Then, the roar ignited. It didn't blast out all at once, but rather rolled like a tidal wave, swelling block by block as the sheer magnitude of the feat finally sank in. By throwing down that monster right out of the gate, he had essentially hijacked the standard difficulty scale, shoving the routine into an entirely different stratosphere. Rivals wouldn't dare touch that kind of jeopardy unless they were deep into their performance with adrenaline peaking, yet Malinin had weaponized it within the first 60 seconds. The truly terrifying part, however, wasn't the jump, it was his utter, chilling lack of a response. No triumphant fist pump, no soaking in the adulation, not a single heartbeat of hesitation. He just bled right into the next transition, weaving seamlessly into the sweeping artistry of the layout. That icy detachment is his absolute signature. Mortals tend to use a monumental landing as an emotional checkpoint, taking a lungful of air and feeding off the roaring fans. Not him. And tonight, that relentless momentum felt like a calculated warning shot, because as the blades kept carving, a new daunting reality began to dawn on everyone. That gravity-defying opener wasn't merely a point grab. It was a declaration of war, a glaring neon sign that the blueprint of this performance was about to completely shred the conventional playbook everyone came expecting to see, which meant an incredibly terrifying thought. the true nightmare-level elements might still be waiting in the shadows. As the lingering echoes of that initial shockwave finally started to fade, a profound shift took hold of the room. The volume dropped, but the raw tension skyrocketed. The audience shifted from passive spectators to desperate detectives, realizing that the opening maneuver had completely shattered the predictable heartbeat of a championship skate. And the renegade pacing wasn't stopping. Back in the spotlight, Ilia Malinin launched into a mesmerizing cascade of edgework, slicing a diagonal path straight through the frozen oval. Footwork rarely gets the average fan out of their seat. You don't get the earth-shattering gasps that a massive leap commands, yet the experts behind the desks scrutinize these moments like hawks. They dissect every lean, every seamless shift of weight, every perilous tilt. His steel etched fierce, suffocating arcs into the frozen canvas, bringing the artistic vision to life. Whiplash direction changes, explosive hits of velocity, and a fleeting, elegant reach of the hands timed flawlessly to the swelling crescendo of the track. To the untrained eye, it was liquid grace. But to the purists dissecting his every glide, a very different story was unfolding. The entire flow felt dangerously erratic. Top-tier routines almost always adhere to an unwritten schematic, a formula that die-hard fans can map out in their sleep. Trainers carefully stockpile the most lucrative tricks for the back half of the show to milk the stamina multipliers for every possible fraction of a point. It's a beautifully staged drama, the elegant introduction, the simmering middle act, and then the all-out athletic barrage at the finale. Yet Malinin was tearing that script to shreds. The heavy artillery was being rolled out violently early. Combos were stacked on top of each other, entirely out of the traditional sequence. Down by the barrier, a rival nation's coach stood frozen, arms crossed tight, dissecting the chaos. He had likely spent countless sleepless nights analyzing old tapes of the young skater until he knew them by heart. Even so, this alien choreography had the veterans scrambling to process the new math. Right around the center ice, Malinin kicked the throttle into overdrive once more. 3 explosive pushes, followed by a vicious crossover. The aggressive bite of steel tearing into the frozen layer amplified, signaling a terrifying accumulation of momentum. It was that unmistakable, gritty crunch of power, a rhythmic grinding that sends shivers down the spine of every skating aficionado. High in the rafters, thousands of bodies unconsciously inched toward the edge of their chairs. You didn't need to know the technical jargon to feel the raw electric danger thick in the air. His posture whispered the impending violence. Malinin let his shoulders sink a mere fraction of an inch. Veterans of the sport knew that subtle shift all too well. It was the calm before an absolute ballistic launch into the rafters. What came next dialed the danger up to an entirely different level. He shattered gravity with a violent thrust, snapping his limbs into a ruthlessly tight coil the millisecond he went airborne. 1, 2, 3, 4 blistering revolutions. The sheer velocity defied physics, suspending the entire stadium in a state of breathless paralysis. Upon impact, the steel runner skidded just a hair across the frozen canvas before biting hard into the ice. A microscopic twitch of his pelvis secured the landing, absolutely flawless. This time around, the audience erupted without a second of delay. A tidal wave of cheers swallowed the venue. The terrifying reality of the moment had finally dawned on everyone. This was no ordinary display of skill. He was weaving a labyrinth of pure athletic madness, where every single sequence laid the groundwork for an even grander design. That overarching blueprint pointed to something utterly insane. The skater had zero intention of easing into the heavy-hitting elements. Instead, he was front-loading his performance with apocalyptic stakes. Down at the scoring desk, a technical expert leaned in and muttered a hush secret to the head controller. The exact phrase never traveled beyond their private bubble, yet the sheer disbelief painted across their features spoke volumes. Assuming their eyes were genuinely tracking the revolutions correctly, this prodigy had just unleashed a pair of the most lethal maneuvers known to the sport right at the starting gun. Yet the performance was only just catching its breath. Down on the frozen stage, Malinin refused to pump the brakes. He melted effortlessly into the ensuing footwork sequence, planting an incredibly terrifying thought into the minds of the scoring officials. If this trajectory of madness kept soaring higher, it meant the most lethal, high-stakes leap of the night was still lurking in the shadows. In that heart-stopping second, every soul in the building pinpointed exactly what monster he was about to unleash. The collective focus of the room sharpened to a razor edge. Every last murmur and hushed whisper in the bleachers evaporated into dead air. The rustle of paper, the shuffling of feet, the mundane echoes of humanity simply vanished. thousands of spectators became utterly hypnotized by the lone figure circling the center ice. Below the spotlights, Ilia Malinin was already turning his body into a human missile. The auditory assault hit you first, a brutal, rhythmic tearing of metal against frozen water, accelerating into a deafening crescendo of momentum. 3 massive pushes, then 4, with each sweeping stride devouring more territory than the one prior. His carved tracks wove a violent tapestry into the surface, etching ghostly silver threads beneath the blinding stadium glare. Down in the pit, an evaluator pushed up their spectacles and hovered inches from the glass, recognizing the terrifying geometry of the skater's stance. Every dedicated analyst of his career knew the warning signs of this exact setup. That brutal tilt of the collarbone, the locked-in pelvis, the razor-sharp lean on the outer blade. He was absolutely not gearing up for a basic trick. He was laying the foundation for a masterstroke. High above, a pocket of supporters from the States started tapping out a quiet, rhythmic beat against the soundtrack. It was a gentle, thrumming heartbeat of support, yet the explosive liftoff remained suspended in time. Malinin simply rode that deep groove endlessly, dragging the sweeping arc from one corner of the arena completely to the other. That specific patience was the ultimate tell. Launching into a tornado of spins demands a massive runway to stockpile absolute maximum velocity and altitude. Should that aggressive lean signify what the terrified judges were guessing, then this young god was winding up to unleash the exact same aerial nightmare that had permanently fractured the history of figure skating. For decades, the Quad Axel existed solely as a ghost story among athletes. 4.5 mid-air revolutions was universally dismissed as a suicidal, unachievable fantasy. Biomechanics experts swore mortal men simply lacked the torque to survive it, a golden rule that stood untouched until this very skater obliterated it. Sticking the world's first successful attempt at an overseas showdown back in 2022 had instantly immortalized him. From that day forward, the mere hint of that signature approach was enough to make thousands of hearts stop simultaneously. And the terrifying approach happening right now in Milan was a mirror image. His legs loaded like springs, his hands collapsed tightly against his chest. For a fraction of a heartbeat, he became a condensed ball of kinetic fury. Then, he fired himself into the stratosphere. The sheer elevation was instantly sickening. He tore upward, slicing straight through the blinding canopy of stadium floods. His calves locked flush as the terrifying spin sequence engaged. 1, 2, 3, 4 blistering turns. Even eagle-eyed purists regularly fail to track the math at that demonic pace. The human eye just cannot process the blur, but the evaluators weren't looking at it like fans. They were dissecting the physics, tracking the launch trajectory, the mid-air axis, and the entry angle, every atomic variable required to validate the maneuver. Then, he smashed violently back onto the frozen earth. His steel weapon gouged out a massive chunk of ice with a vicious, echoing tear. For one terrifying split second, the momentum threatened to rip him entirely off balance. The runner skidded slightly, grabbed traction, and locked down flawlessly. Absolute pandemonium tore through the stadium, a deafening explosion of pure, instantaneous awe. A deafening roar swallowed the arena as thousands of fans suddenly grasped the sheer magnitude of the gravity-defying feat just pulled off under agonizing Olympic tier stakes. Yet, the immediate aftermath defied absolutely every single expectation. 0 fist pumps from Malinin. No triumphant poses or acknowledging the roaring audience. He just kept his blades moving, melting seamlessly right into the next sequence, treating that earth-shattering leap like a routine stroll in the park. Down at the officials' panel, a chilling epiphany was dawning. The brutal architecture of his performance was glaringly obvious now. The prodigy wasn't merely throwing Hail Marys. He was scattering these monstrous tricks to create an unbroken chokehold of tension. 0 chance to catch his breath. No cozy lull in the action to regroup. Just a relentless barrage of athletic torture, hinting at a terrifying truth. The true climax of this lethal gauntlet was still lurking ahead. Assuming this merciless trajectory held its ferocious course, the closing act would unleash his most reckless gamble yet. As the performance crossed over into its concluding phase, a heavy, almost suffocating mood blanketed the stadium. It wasn't sheer hype, it was raw anxiety, the haunting vibe that hits when history is being written right before your eyes, transcending a flawless run to become a paradigm shift that permanently shatters everything the world knows about the sport. Down on the frozen stage, Ilia Malinin drove his edges deep, sweeping majestically back into the spotlight. Fatigue was undoubtedly creeping in, betrayed by the ragged, desperate rise and fall of his chest. Totally inevitable. Surviving a marathon of mid-air tornadoes takes a horrific toll on human anatomy. Each violent return to the ice blasts shockwaves from the steel runners straight up to the vertebrae. Nobody escapes that brutal physics equation. Yet the skater refused to hit the brakes. Shockingly, he cranked up the velocity. 3 massive surgical strides launched him corner to corner with absolutely zero wasted energy. Above the waist, he maintained absolute serenity. Below, his legs churned with pure explosive horsepower. Die-hard purists live for that exact duality, absolute unflinching mastery. In the elite ranks, that razor-thin composure separates catastrophic wipeouts from immortal glory. As the soundtrack swelled to a frantic crescendo, the looming trick boldly broadcasted its terrifying identity. A massive, aggressive curve carved deeply into the frozen sheet. The extreme angle was the initial dead giveaway. The clincher hit when he locked his arms to his chest, a heartbeat prematurely. Down by the technical monitors, an adjudicator practically fell out of their chair. A second ripped their eyes away from the digital interface. The stakes were astronomical right here. Malinin coiled like a spring and violently shattered gravity. His insane altitude was instantly undeniable. Launching toward the rafters with immaculate, breathtaking precision, he spun like a blur, flashing the superhuman velocity that crowned him with his mythical moniker, the Quad God. Spin after dizzying spin, thousands of lungs completely froze in suspense. Smashing back down, his steel shrieked against the frost. For a terrifying microsecond, his momentum wavered on a dangerous, skidding edge. But he wrestled it back from the brink. A microscopic shift in his pelvis locked it in. One twitch of his trailing boot, and he was rock solid. The stands went absolutely nuclear in an instant. A visceral, deafening sonic boom of pure hype. The expert panel, however, painted a contrasting picture, calculating, stoic, completely stripped of fanboy awe. They finally decoded his master plan. While the entire grid hoarded their nukes for the late-game multiplier, this kid constructed a marathon of unyielding torment. From the dropping of the needle to the dying chords, the throttle stayed pinned dangerously to the floor. Zero coasting. No traditional lazy crescendo to rest on. Nothing but a brutal combo of death-defying feats stitched tightly with absolutely merciless footwork. It was a vicious, highly premeditated assault. Winding down on the rink, the prodigy rode a grand, sweeping arc to close out his routine right as the track dissolved into complete silence. Only in that quiet aftermath did the stadium collectively exhale its suffocating dread. Cheers flooded the rafters. Yet the true story wasn't the pandemonium, it was the deeply stunned faces behind the scoring laptops. Adjudicators traded silent, mind-blown stares, realizing this showcase didn't merely raise the athletic bar. It fundamentally demolished the accepted blueprint of figure skating. And that paradigm shift is what history will genuinely cling to. No singular, mind-bending trick, no isolated highlight reel, just the terrifying architecture of the whole damn thing. True revolution doesn't always roar in on the back of one unheard-of stunt. Often, it sneaks in quietly, a complete reimagining of the game board itself. And if the awe rippling through the Italian crowds that afternoon was any indicator, the world was finally waking up to the staggering fact that they had just witnessed exactly that.